going to share my screen again briefly to provide something of an introduction for those who joined recently. We now will be moving to our second panel. We'll have Phyllis Bennis and Ngakiya Camara is going to be able to stay with us for part of the second panel before she also has to move to class. Raed Jarrar, Peter Kuznick, Laura Nader, and Nasreen Sajady, who also is coming a bit later from class. She's a teacher. Again, thank you to everyone for juggling schedules and making it possible for you to be here. I also just want to thank again the College of Arts and Sciences at American University, as well as the Department of Anthropology, the Department of History, and Historians for Peace and Democracy for making today's event possible. Again, for those who might have joined late, and for those watching on the video, I do want to just provide a little quick context for our conversation today. I should also introduce myself again. I'm David Vine, I'm professor of anthropology at American University. Around the 9/11 anniversary, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we heard frequently that we should never forget those who died in the horrific attacks of 9/11, the roughly 3,000 people who died. And indeed, we should not forget those deaths. We should not forget any deaths in my mind. This political intervention from the streets of Manhattan, I think, was an important one to never forget the scale of death in Afghanistan. I just point out that the estimate of deaths here, 180,000 in Afghanistan, just captures those who have died in combat, that is civilians and combatants dead in combat. By my estimate, a conservative estimate of total deaths, including indirect deaths, those who've died because of wars, destruction of food supplies, of healthcare facilities, of other infrastructure, because of disease and other causes. The total death toll in Afghanistan could easily be around 750,000 people dead. This slide attempts to do the impossible, to encapsulate something about the war on terror, the past 20 years of war in a single slide. Builds off the important work of the Cost of War Project at Brown University, which has shown that in direct combat alone, upwards of 900,000 people have died in not just Afghanistan, but Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and beyond. By my estimate, using the best estimate of indirect deaths, again, those people who died not just because of direct combat, but because of disease, the destruction of food supplies, destruction of health and other infrastructure and other causes, it's probably likely that 4.5 million people have died in the war on terror, in the post 9/11 wars. Tens of millions have surely been injured. 38 million have been displaced, as we talked about a bit in the first panel. Again, this is building on the work that one of our earlier panelists, Jenny Walkup, and I and a group of students at American University did in collaboration with the Cost of War Project. Cost of War Project has also estimated that US taxpayers have already spent or obligated $8 trillion, $8 trillion, that's trillion with a T, on the post 9/11 wars. And that's not total spending on the military. If you add in what is considered regular military spending, we reach $14 trillion that US taxpayers have spent on the military since 2001. And when we think about the human damage, the human costs of the post 9/11 wars, I think we have to clearly think about what that money wasn't spent on. Let's just take the $8 trillion spent alone on the wars, what that money didn't go to fund. We could think about the hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths that we might have prevented if we had invested adequately in pandemic preparedness, or probably hundreds of thousands more lives we could have saved or prolonged if we had a system of universal healthcare that we could have funded with $8 trillion, or universal college, free college education for people in the United States, building a green infrastructure, ensuring that people don't go hungry in the United States and beyond. The list goes on of what we could have done with that 8 trillion. The last circle here points to some of where that money went. The $8 trillion didn't just disappear. A very significant portion of it went to military contractors, arms manufacturers like Lockheed Martin. This attempts to capture the value, the increase in the value of Lockheed Martin stock between 2001 and 2021. Profits went up similarly. And not just for Lockheed Martin, but for the other major arms manufacturers, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Halliburton, infrastructure, built large part of the infrastructure of military bases that grew up in the post 9/11 period. Numbers, of course, can only capture so much, and actually at a certain point, especially numbers like 4.5 million dead, they become numbing and perhaps even dehumanizing, distancing us from the reality of what 4.5 million deaths means. I think it actually takes some really concerted effort to try to grapple with what 4.5 million dead means, or what 38 million displaced means. The closest I've been able to come is to try to think for myself about how I would feel if I had to flee for my life tonight, or how I would feel if a family member or friend was killed by combat, by a drone strike. I wanted to do this before, but I think it might be worthwhile taking just a moment of silence to think about the human lives damaged and destroyed and so often ended in these post 9/11 wars that my tax dollars have helped to fund. Thank you. One disclosure, you note the name of Northrop Grumman here. It's important to point out that one of the most recent members of the American University Board of Trustees is the former CEO and chair of Northrop Grumman, Wes Bush. You heard a bit about, and I think we'll hear again. His presence on the board has not affected the composition of this panel or any aspect of this panel or my work or the work of anyone here as far as I know, but it is important to disclose this tie. Sorry for my fumbling with the Zoom controls. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers, and we're going to go in alphabetical order. I'm going to introduce each of them before they speak, just briefly. We want to reserve as much time as possible for conversation. I've asked them really to take on an impossible task to answer really two questions. One, what are the three most important things people should know or learn about the post 9/11 wars? And what are the three most important things that we need to change? Each of our speakers could surely speak for another 2 hours on their own about those issues, but I've asked them to try to do it in 7 or 8 minutes so we can ensure that we have as much time as possible for conversation and questions and discussion in the time that remains. We had a terrific conversation in the first panel, and I am sure we're going to have another terrific conversation Let me just thank the panelists and thank everyone who was involved in putting this together. I do want to publicly thank again some of the individuals who helped make this possible, including the Senior Administrative Assistant in the Department of Anthropology, Jeannie Wogeman, as well as our Dean, Max Paul Friedman, Haley Jardis, the entire CAS Dean's Office, Erica Fortwengler, Nikolai Roster, Thomas Meal, and the terrific people who are providing captioning services today. Phyllis Bennis, who was nice enough to join us in our first panel. I am very excited that you're here. I'm excited that all our speakers are here, but Phyllis Bennis directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, US wars, and UN issues. She's also a fellow at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the US and around the world. Phyllis has written and edited at least 11 books, including Before and After, US Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy US Power. Phyllis, please take us away.
Sorry?
We hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. I thought I didn't get the mute right, as usual. Thank you, David, for organizing this, and thanks to all who helped organize it and to all of you for coming. I'm doing something right now that I almost never do, which is I'm going to sort of abide by the rules or requests that David made. I don't usually do that, but I'm going to try, except with one amendment. I gave up on trying to figure out what are the three most important takeaways about the 20 years of the war on terror. So what I'm going to look at is three takeaways that I think might not have been covered by other people. I didn't hear most of the first panel, so I may be wrong about that. But these are important ones. Are they the most important? I don't even know that we can make that judgment. But let me start with number one. Number one is we should recognize that 9/11 did not change the world. 9/12 is another story. 9/12, I would argue, did indeed change the world, because that was when George Bush announced that the response to this horrific crime that had been committed, this crime against humanity, in fact, that was committed on 9/11, would be answered by going to war, by taking the world to war. And there was nothing automatic about that. There was nothing automatic about going to war. There was a claim that the American people would have demanded it if Bush didn't lead that way. Not true. People were really paralyzed in response to this horrific crime, and in my view, would have followed any number of proposals about how to respond. We were given the option of responding to war. And a vast majority of people, we should be clear, did support that, but it's not the same as saying that people were somehow demanding that on their own. And again, and I think this point that we were hearing about earlier about American exceptionalism, US exceptionalism, is a very, very crucial component of this, because it was based on the notion that this horrific crime that our people in this country had suffered was somehow the worst crisis in the world. That when that happened, all other crises ceased to exist. And that was clearly not the case. What was the case was that many around the world, in every country, stood in solidarity with the people of this country who had suffered this horrific loss. But as soon as it was announced that we're going to go to war against the world, taking as many of the world with us as possible against the others, we lost that. We lost that human solidarity. And people followed Bush's call into war. But it was not inevitable, and it did not reflect the reality that somehow the whole world had changed. There was a very important phrase that Kofi Annan used in his Nobel speech that year when he got the Nobel Prize. And he said, the crises affecting people around the world on September 10th, the crises of hunger, the crises of poverty, the crises of other wars, still existed on September 11th. The coup in Chile that had happened on September 11th, its memory was still as sharp, still as strong. So we were not the only people to suffer a horrific crime. That was number one. Number two, the authorizations for the use of military force. And of course, today is the 20th anniversary of the day that first authorization for the use of military force, where all members of Congress, other than the heroic Barbara Lee, voted to support this blank check to go to war. What's crucial for us to remember here is that those authorizations tell the president that the Congress is saying it's fine to go to war. It makes it legal under US law. It doesn't take into account whether in fact it's legal under international law. And this one wasn't. Because while the UN Charter, among other things, is very vague about a lot of things, it's very clear about one thing, which is what does it take for a country to go to war against another country and make it legal? There's only two things. Either it was legitimized and called for by the Security Council, did not happen, or it's immediate self-defense, which was also not the case. Might have been argued if the US had shot down the second plane before it hit the towers. That would be an arguable point of self-defense. Going to war across the world 3 weeks later against a country whose nationals had not played any part in committing this crime does not count as self-defense. And of course, it made it easier. It made it easier when the nature of the war changed, the number of US casualties dropped while casualties in Afghanistan, later in Iraq, rose. It made it easier for people in this country to turn away, to simply forget that that war was still going on. So the authorizations only speak to US war and do not answer the questions of international law. Third, and this is specific to Afghanistan. As you all know, there's been a ton of questioning about, has the Taliban changed? Is the Taliban going to be different now that they have come back and they're in power again? Was the 20 years for nothing? And we can certainly argue that it was worse than nothing, that this war was fought at this enormous, enormous human cost. But I think what we do have to keep in mind is we don't know how much the individuals who make up the Taliban leadership have or have not changed. What we do know is that the world in which they are governing has changed dramatically. Afghanistan has changed. Afghans have changed. The condition of life has changed. And they're going to have to rule with those things in mind. The role of Afghanistan in the global economy, completely different. The role of knowledge about the world in the smallest villages of Afghanistan is qualitatively different now than it was 20 years ago. All of that is different. So we're going to have to look at that in a very different way. So those are the three things I wanted to just flag that I think are important for us to keep in mind. Not necessarily the most important, but important things. Very quickly, 3 points, and here I am changing a little bit. This isn't necessarily what we have to change, but what we have to build. So number one, we have to build movements to end these wars that are based both on domestic and the economic issues, the costs of war, and why we need that money for healthcare, for jobs, for infrastructure, for a Green New Deal, for all of these things, and for international and moral reasons to stop killing people around the rest of the world. We can't build movements leaving out either of those criteria. We can't build strong and powerful movements, and those movements need to be about cutting the military budget. As Larry said earlier, cutting in half is a pretty good start. That's not the end, but it would be a very good start. Number two, those movements that we build need to include the focus on domestic militarization, even beyond the wars that are waged abroad. So the $8 trillion, this unbelievable amount of money that has been spent on the military in these wars over the last 20 years, the $14 trillion that's been spent on the military as a whole, on the Defense Department and the nuclear weapons as a whole in these last 20 years, is dwarfed by another figure that my colleagues at the National Priorities Project at IPS have figured out in just the last month or so, which is that $21 trillion has been the cost of militarization domestically as well as abroad. That means ICE. That means what happens to immigrants at the border. That means the militarization of police by sending weapons from Afghanistan directly to any police force that wants them, so that when Mike Brown is killed in Ferguson, you suddenly have armored personnel carriers on the streets of this small town. Why? Because they were offered for free from the Pentagon. That's what has to stop. And last, our movements need to include accountability. We have had 20 years now where no one has said, "Ooh, you know what? Wow, there really weren't any weapons of mass destruction. Maybe we got to make good on that. Maybe we've got to do something different. Maybe we should be talking about holding Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Rice and all of them accountable in a whole different way." We need to be accountable to the people who have been victimized by these wars. That means reparations. It means compensation. It does not mean further occupation, but it does mean reparation, and we have heard no talk of it. We can't have movements that don't take accountability seriously. That's going to be one of the crucial points of judgment of whether our movements can succeed or not. It includes taking in all the refugees that are looking for a place to be safe, not only those to whom we made promises who were interpreters for US troops or whatever. Yes, for them, but for all of the people forced to leave their homes, the 38 million people that David was speaking of, whether they are climate refugees, economic refugees, caused by these wars. We owe them all a debt. And we owe it to the people who stay, the people who remain in Afghanistan, the 40 million people who are still there, who right now don't have enough food or water or access to electricity. This is our responsibility. That is just as important as holding the perpetrators accountable. So those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Fantastic as always. And I love that you questioned the question, then changed the question. A good lesson for everyone. I'm going to turn things back to Ngakiya Camara. Some of you may have seen Ngakiya in the first panel. We thought it was important to have Ngakiya, leader of the American University Dissenters group, be part of both panels because they are so focused on doing exactly what Phyllis just outlined, that is building movements, building a movement of youth in particular to take back the money from the military industrial congressional complex and some of the 21 trillion that we've already spent. Let me let Ngakiya speak for herself. Take it away.
Yeah, first of all, I would just like to thank Phyllis Bennis so much for that framing. It really leads very well into what Dissenters does. So I just wanted to thank you for all of that, and especially what you were saying about what our movements should consist of, because that's really what Dissenters focuses on. So again, thank you. So I'm going to provide a little bit of framing before I get into what Dissenters does and what we're doing here at American University. Being at the heart of DC at this prestigious institution for the last 3 years has ironically taught me a lot about the nation state we're so proudly named after. As we sit and learn on stolen Nakantak, Anacostan, and Piscataway territory, I recognize this country as a 500-year-long colonial project, a project forged in white supremacy, grounded in exploitative racial capitalism, and mobilized through relentless oppression. A colonial project whose function relies on a combative otherization that promises a persistent enemy, the antithesis of the white, the wealthy, the capitalist, to be fought, controlled, and won over in the name of imperialist objectives. This includes Indigenous peoples who were slaughtered in the name of colonial expansion, the Black folks whose enslavement promised persistent capitalist exploitation, and Arabs villainized in an effort to maintain control of oil and other resources abroad. It is this reality of exploitation, It is a colonial project generating a false white supremacist illusion, an enthusiastic oblivion which obscures this reality of exploitation and promises comfort to those that contribute to the order of the system. These people become willing agents of the state, reiterating American patriotic rhetoric or serving as the armed militia which both lined the streets to disappear Black and brown communities and storm the Capitol at the president's convenience, who rely upon and defend this colonial project to maintain their state-sanctioned supremacy. Those willing agents, and especially the hegemony they serve, will continue to line their pockets from our suffering, benefiting as industries grow from our poverty and exploitation, profiting from fueling wars on our streets and abroad to maintain unlicensed access to endless resources, to extract free labor, and to gain monetarily from industries like the weapons manufacturers, which rely on this turmoil to expand. We strive to demolish this colonial project, this supremacy, this hierarchy. We strive to realize a vision that encourages not power over, but power with. A vision in which we collectively contribute to the creation of systems that work for all of us. This is why I've joined Dissenters, a national organization working to turn the tide against war by educating youth about the threat of the military-industrial complex and how war and militarism impact their everyday lives. Emphasizing the destruction from war on a global scale, Dissenters stresses the inevitable connectedness between militarism, police violence, racism, poverty, climate change, and other phenomena that persistently threatens global societies while perpetuating violence against marginalized communities at home. And that includes Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, impoverished communities, and etc. Overall, our goal is to reclaim resources and funding persistently given to war-making industries, including weapons manufacturers and war profiteers, and to redirect those resources to our communities, as well as life-giving institutions like our education system. The Divest from Death campaign ultimately embodies this latter mission of Dissenters, asking youth to urge their schools to divest in wealth, research, and overall support from any war industry they may have stakes in. With this campaign, we hope that major educational institutions stop funding and researching for war industries, and that this can increase the stigma of war for our generation. At American University specifically, our first goal within this divestment campaign is to remove Wes Bush, former CEO of Northrop Grumman, from our Board of Trustees, who David mentioned earlier. I'm sure that you're all aware that Northrop Grumman is one of 5 major weapons manufacturing companies in the world. During his time there, he oversaw the mass creation of B-2 bombers, F-35s, and other lethal weapons and technologies used to assault and destroy populations all over the world, including against Palestinians. Wes Bush has made a career profiting from war, and he does not represent American University, nor does he reflect American University's values and initiatives. As members of the AU community, we urge you all to join our call to remove war profiteer Wes Bush from his position and encourage him to resign. As AU proudly advertises being an institution with a reputation for creating meaningful change in the world, and where leaders of today train the leaders of tomorrow, appointing someone like Bush to a leadership position is in deep contradiction with these stated values. It is the responsibility of those in leadership at AU to take immediate action on these issues. I'm going to place a few links in the chat for all of you. First is a letter letting our administration know that we want no ties with war criminals, warmongers, and profiteers feeding on death and destruction for wealth. I encourage you all, students and professors, AU affiliated or not, to sign this letter. And if there are any students here interested in organizing with us, please fill out our interest form. I'll place all of those in the chat for you. Thank you again for allowing me to speak with you all. And I'll place our social media links as well.
Ngakiya, thank you so much. I really appreciate your contributions, and please do check out the links that Ngakiya put in the chat. For those folks watching the video on YouTube later, all the links referred to by any of our speakers will be in the description section of the video. I'm also pasting in the chat, and also you'll find it in the description section, a list of resources and links, organizations, including those represented by some of our panelists. Let me move quickly because we want to move to have some exchange from the panelists and then an exchange with the audience. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Raed Jarrar, after I try to pin him.
I'm here.
Fantastic. my own speed of my transitions needs some polishing. Raed Jarrar is an Arab American political advocate and advocacy director at Democracy for the Arab World Now. Widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economic developments in the Middle East and North Africa region. He's testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings. Raed has made frequent appearances in national and international media outlets in Arabic and English, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, New York Times, and many, many others. Raed was raised in countries across the Middle East and has a BA from the University of Baghdad and an MA from the University of Jordan. Please take us away, Raed.
Thank you, David. It's really good to see you. Hello, everyone. I was in the Middle East when the 9/11 attacks happened. And I just so happened to be in Baghdad in 2003 when US bombs fell in my neighborhood and US tanks rolled down the street, occupying Iraq after the 2003 war. So I saw firsthand the immediate reaction to 9/11, what Phyllis Bennis calls the 9/12. Like I lived that firsthand in Baghdad, what happened because of what happened in September 12th and the reactionary, militarized, unjustified response to the attacks. I also lived through the very heavy price that Muslim Americans have paid since 9/11 after immigrating to the United States. I have experienced firsthand discrimination and Islamophobia in the United States, whether it is at airports or workplaces or within our political discussions in this country. So in a way, I've had the first-hand opportunity to experience both sides of what happened in the last 2 decades, whether it is the US foreign policy, the militarized foreign policy out there in Iraq and the Middle East, or whether it is the discourse here in Washington, DC, where I have lived for the last 15 years. I want to say, like, unfortunately, not much has changed. And this is to address the assignments by David. Not much has changed in Washington, D.C. Like we saw the rhetoric that came from President Biden when he withdrew from Afghanistan 20 years after 9/11. But the rhetoric doesn't really signify a strategic change in US thinking, in US analysis, or US engagement with the world. In a way, President Biden said, we have to withdraw because it's not really good for us to be there. And he kind of sort of blamed, quote unquote, the Afghans for what's going on, the collapse that has been going on in the country, etc. I didn't really feel like a remorseful analysis of a strategic disaster that has taken place in 20 years. What I heard from President Biden and others in DC is very similar rhetoric to the one that was used after the US withdrew from Iraq, which is a rhetoric that blames Iraqis for the failure of the US interventionist project. Iraqis were not ready for democracy. They're kind of too stuck with their ancient hatred. Sunnis hate Shia and Shia hate Sunnis, and they don't really like democracy. They don't really have a good taste for it. And we heard the same about Afghans. That Afghans, they were, we could give them training on how to use weapons, but we can't train them to have determination to fight for the future of their country. So like there was no actual moment of realization that the United States 21 wars were a strategic mistake. They were a disaster. They were plain out wrong, the wrong response to 9/11. I've never heard that from the powers to be in Washington, D.C. So I think for me, the number one takeaway is that our country has not learned its lesson for the last 20 years. That is the number one, the most important, the most devastating analysis for what happened in 20 years is that we are still at a place to make the same mistakes because the underlying assumptions for how to engage with other countries around the world have not changed. We still have two main interventionist discourses in Washington, D.C. One is the humanitarianist, like humanitarian interventionism, mostly coming from the Democratic Party, which, justifies U.S. dropping bombs for someone else's good. Like we have to bomb other countries for their own good, to save women and support LGBT communities and bring democracy, kill the bad guys for their own good. And then there is the more hawkish Republican discourse about taking the fight out there instead of them coming to kill us. We haven't really created a space, and it's really sad that 20 years into after 9/11 that we don't really have an established space within the establishment in Washington, D.C. To shift that larger foreign policy engagement. The other thing, so like that's like my number one take. The second take, which I alluded to earlier, is about Muslim Americans. Muslim Americans continue to pay a very, very heavy price to the 9/11 attacks. Muslim Americans continue to be vilified and othered by mainstream politicians to date. And we see these Islamophobic tropes repeated in the media almost every day. It has become a part of the collective psyche in the US, and whether it is attacks on members of Congress because of their ethnic and religious background, whether it's attacks on members of our communities, whether it is US policies that directs resources and policies against Muslim and Arab American communities, that is directly linked to the policies of post 9/11, and those have not been dealt with head on as well. So, I mean, I've met David. You and I met a long time ago, and I feel like the spaces that David has created, Phyllis, other people on the call have grown. We have definitely established more of a foothold on having this analysis out there, but it is still an alternative analysis. We're the rebels who might be called to CNN or MSNBC once or twice a year as like sideline revolutionary, like out of the ordinary analysis, But when it comes to the mainstream voices in DC, unfortunately, we're still stuck. We're still stuck with almost the same kind of rhetoric. And I will end this by saying that the first day I met David, it's been like maybe 14 years ago or something. We met through this network to oppose US bases. And it has gotten much worse since. The US spending on militarism has gotten worse. The percentage of how much money we spend on military spending every year, percentage of that to the full budget in the US has gotten much worse. Back in the day, it used to be, like in the 50% of the discretionary spending was going to militarized spending. Now it's approaching 60%. The number of bases around the world is still huge. So it is unfortunately not a good trajectory, and we will continue to build our political power. We will continue to build our analysis, but at the same time, I think it is sobering, and it's important to realize how vast, how heavy of a task it is to change direction of this massive, tanker that we're on, called U.S. foreign policy, to change its direction from the current one to a different one in the future. Let me stop here, David.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to have known you for so long. I will be interested to see if others among the panelists have a similar take on the trajectory that we've seen in the last 20 years and where they think the trajectory will go from here. But let me turn things over. We're moving alphabetically to Peter Kuznick, another wonderful old friend. Let me spotlight him and just say quickly that Peter Kuznick is professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Peter has written or co-authored many books, including with Oliver Stone, The Untold History of the United States, which is also a 10-part Showtime documentary film series. Peter was active in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements and remains active in anti-war and nuclear abolition efforts and anti-nuclear movements. In 2003, Kuznick organized a group of scholars, writers, artists, clergy, and others to protest the celebratory display of the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb, at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. He regularly provides commentary for major US and international media outlets. Peter, please take it away.
Thank you, David. Before I start my 8-minute sprint on the history of the American Empire, I'd like to comment briefly on something you said. You talked about the 4.5 million people who've died as a result of America's war on terror post 9/11. When Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, came into my class several years ago, he said he accepted that 3.8 million Vietnamese died during the US invasion of Vietnam. And that's a stunning figure, much higher than you'll read in most of the books. I think it's accurate. Most of my students, when I ask them, say they've visited the Vietnam Memorial Monument in Washington, D.C. Almost all of them have, at least pre-COVID. And if you go there, you've got the names of 58,280 Americans who died in Vietnam. The two walls there that the names are on are 492 feet long. I calculate that, and the message of that memorial is that the tragedy of Vietnam was that 58,280 Americans died. Well, if that memorial actually had the names also of the 3.8 million Vietnamese, the million Laotians and Cambodians, all the Brits and Aussies and Thais and South Koreans and others who died, it would actually be more than 8 miles long. And that would be a fitting memorial to the Vietnam War. The memorial we're going to need to the last 20 years of wars is going to be even longer than that. And that's another tragic commentary. But now I'll start on the clock. As a historian, I frame 9/11 a little differently than most people do. For me, 9/11 begins not in 2001, but back in 1978, with the coming to power in Afghanistan of the pro-Soviet secular Taraki Amin government, which was initially, even the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Washington Post said had tremendous popular support. Well, it did have some popular support, but it also had a lot of opposition because their program was basically threefold. One was modernization, industrialization. Secondly, was land reform. And thirdly, was education. Now, this is a country, Taraki said at the time that that the future looks very bright for the Afghan people. The New York Times reporter William Borders took issue with that. He said the future does not look bright. This is a country that has an average life expectancy of 40 years, an average GDP of $70, the equivalent of 20 cents a day, 10% literacy rates. They say this really hasn't changed at all from 2,000 years earlier when Alexander the Great went through there and saw the same mud huts. But the tasks that have confronted them were enormous. But the group that was triggered by the reforms that the secular government was proposing in Afghanistan was the Mujahideen, Islamic extremists. And what they hated more than anything else was the fact that the new government was educating women. The people who the US supported, this was Brzezinski's project, were the ones who were going into the schools and shooting the teachers and actually going in there and skinning them alive. But Brzezinski saw an opportunity here. Fanatically anti-Soviet, anti-communist national security advisors, the big near Brzezinski, started working with the CIA without the support of Carter in order to inflame and support these Islamic extremists. Finally, on July 3rd, 1979, Carter signs the memorandum authorizing US military support. And Brzezinski wrote, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president, which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. So that Brzezinski knew that, and he understood that this Islamic rebellion uprising inside Afghanistan was going to terrify the Soviet leaders because they were afraid that there'd be a similar uprising of the 40 million Muslims inside the Soviet Union. So the new government there asked the Soviets for military help. The Soviets hesitated to do so because Brezhnev and the others knew that the Soviet intervention would mean the end of détente, mean the end of SALT II, would mean effectively the end of the Olympics. So they didn't do so until Christmas Day, 1979, when they finally do intervene. Brezhnev mistakenly said it was going to take 3 or 4 weeks and we'll be out of there. They were in there for another 10 years. But when that happened, the sanctimonious Brzezinski and even Carter were making these public statements about how appalled they were. Brzezinski wasn't appalled. He was ecstatic. He said, now we've finally given the Soviet Union its own Vietnam. And Carter absurdly called the invasion, quote, the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. He announced the Carter Doctrine, which initiated a whole new level of American involvement in the Middle East at that point. But the war really escalates under Reagan. And it was under Reagan that the CIA spent $3 billion for the biggest covert operation up to that point to support these Mujahideen. They were supported in camps in Pakistan with money from Saudi Arabia, money and training from the United States. And we were training them in not only in assassination and terrorism, but Islamic extremism there. And so these were the people who later formed the Taliban. That's where Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were being trained. A lot of the people who blow back on us much later. But the people we were supporting were the extremists. We were supporting, for example, we gave money to Zia, president of Pakistan, who was channeling it to Gulbuddin Haqbatiyar, a man of legendary cruelty who, according to the director of terrorism studies at West Point, quote, was known to patrol the bazaars of Kabul with vials of acid, which he would throw in the face of any woman who dared to walk outdoors without a full burqa covering her face. These are the people we were supporting. When Gorbachev took office in 1985 in the Soviet Union, he tried to withdraw Soviet troops, but the US did everything it could to tie the Soviets down as long as we could. The Soviets withdraw in 1989, the government falls in 1992. The Soviets asked the US to work with them to curb extremism in Afghanistan. The US could not be bothered. A civil war ensues there, and led by, there were a couple factions. One was the refugees who studied in madrasas in Pakistan, the Saudi-funded Wahhabi training madrasas, the religious schools in Pakistan. The religious students were known as the Talibs, and they later go on to form the Taliban with the help from Pakistani intelligence. Many had received their military training in the US supported camps. Many of those were educated in these schools with books that were written and training manuals from the University of Nebraska at Omaha Center for Afghanistan Studies, and with violently horrible books that were being used, that the Taliban used themselves when they took power in 1996, simply taking out the human pictures, which they consider blasphemous. According to the RAND expert, Cheryl Bernard, whose husband, Zalmay Khalilzad, had been the main US liaison to Afghanistan and was recently in charge of negotiations with the Taliban, she wrote, "We made a deliberate choice. At first, everyone thought there's no way to beat the Soviets. So what we have to do is throw the worst crazies against them that we can find." And there was a lot of collateral damage. We knew exactly who these people were and what their organizations were like, and we didn't care. Then we allowed them to get rid of, just kill all the moderate leaders. The reason we don't have any moderate leaders in Afghanistan today is because we let the nuts kill them all. They killed the leftists, the moderates, the middle of the roaders. They were just eliminated during the 1980s and afterwards. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the neocons were again ecstatic. In 1990, neocon strategist Charles Krauthammer announces that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US is the world's unipolar power. He says that this could last 30 or 40 years. They come up in 1993 with a defense planning guidance, which talks about the US is so powerful, we cannot allow anybody to emerge anywhere in any region who can threaten the United States, even in that specific region. They were forced to walk it back, but the people behind this, the Wolfowitzes and the others, then go on to form the Project for a New American Century. These folks are, again, the neocon strategists for empire, who are the ones who go into the George W. Bush administration and push the crazy wars that we've been talking about. In the year 2000, they came up with a report that many people are familiar with called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And they said the kind of defense spending we like is likely to be a long one to rebuild, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, they got that on 9/11. And even that, the history there is very, very murky. My friends of mine who were in the FBI in Minneapolis were reporting back to Washington about Muslims who were learning how to fly and had no interest in learning how to land their planes. Those reports were coming back here. Bush was getting briefed almost daily in the president's daily briefings with reports like headlines, Osama bin Laden planning to attack in the United States. We knew what was happening. The NSC counterterrorism chief, Richard Clark, testified that CIA director George Tenet was running around Washington with his hair on fire, trying to get the attention of Bush, Rice, and Rumsfeld. They couldn't be bothered. They didn't care. And then the attack hits, but then they're ready to move quickly with the Patriot Act. They begin talking about the invasion of Iraq, as Phyllis was saying, on 9/11 and 9/12. But first, the US has got to invade Afghanistan, which takes place within days of the attack on 9/11. But we gave Afghanistan an ultimatum. We said, turn over bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leaders, or else we're going to invade. Well, according to Milton Bearden, who was the US station chief in Pakistan and ran the war from there between 1986 and 1989, he said that the Taliban were desperate to give up bin Laden. He said they wanted some face-saving help from the United States. They offered to give him up to the Organization of Islamic Conferences, but the United States did not comply. We wanted to invade, and we did invade, and that was in early October. But as early as October 15, 2001, William Crystal's Weekly Standard had a cover story titled "Making the Case for American Empire." And the neocons start coming out of the woodwork. In 2002, Charles Krauthammer revisited his idea, this is the unipolar moment, and he said, I was wrong. I underestimated. He said that US domination is so powerful, nothing has ever existed like this disparity of power, nothing. He said he was wrong, that it was not the unipolar moment, it was the unipolar era. It was not going to last 30 or 40 years. It was going to last indefinitely into the future. Then with the invasion of Iraq, and even before that, on January 5th, 2003, the New York Times headlined its Sunday magazine section, "American Empire, Get Used to It." And they all came out of the woodwork then. For example, a British senior official told Newsweek, everyone wants to go to Baghdad. Real men want to go to Tehran. Undersecretary of State John Bolton, who the North Koreans have called human scum and a bloodsucker, Bolton voted for going after Syria and North Korea. They all came up with their lists. Retired General Wesley Clark visited the Pentagon in November 2001 and was told by a senior military officer of a 5-year campaign that was going to begin with Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Syria, then Lebanon, then Libya, then Iran, then Somalia, then Sudan. They had this whole thing mapped out. Unfortunately for them, things went down very quickly in Afghanistan and Iraq. By September 2004, Amr Moussa, the head of the Arab League, announced, quote, "The gates of hell are open in Iraq." It became a jihadi Super Bowl. They all came in from all around the world. And by 2006, even Krauthammer got it. He penned an obituary for the unipolar era. He announced that unipolarity had peaked in 2005, it was now past the apogee, he said. And from then, we now have had another 15 years of US flailing about, fighting these wars at a time when the US empire has been in its death throes. But that has not stopped us. You know, and as Larry was saying earlier, talking about the threats from climate change, talking about the nuclear threat, the dangers that we face, which I could go on for a long time, but I don't have time to do it. I just want to say that we're still bombing 7 Muslim countries. We still have 800 bases around the world. I mean, US is trying to maintain this unipolarity in a multipolar world, and it's not going to work. And it's not only wrongheaded, it's extraordinarily dangerous, which is why the bulletin of atomic scientists has the hands of the doomsday clock at 100 seconds before midnight, the closest it's ever been. And so we're facing a very perilous situation that I look forward to discussing with everybody in this question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Peter. Let me turn things now quickly to Dr. Laura Nader. If you are not an anthropologist, well, I hope everyone knows who Laura Nader is, but it's really an unusual privilege to get to hear from her, especially online. She's one of the leading anthropologists in the world today. She's the author of many books, including Plunder, When the Rule of Law is Illegal, What the Rest Think of the West, and Controlling Processes. And most recently, the author of Laura Nader, Letters to and from an Anthropologist. Nader is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I am particularly thrilled that you are with us today. So please take us away.
Thank you, David, and thank you for doing this. Very important. Thank you, colleagues, for all the things that you said, informing Americans from various angles. What I have to say is much briefer and hopefully helpful to the young, who, if they're buried in the history of things, don't know what to do today. First thing we did in our department after 9/11 was have a discussion about what it was. And I argued then it was a crime, not a war. It was a crime. So where were the law professors? Where were the law schools talking about this? They were quiet as they planned to go to war. So it's something simple as how you define something. It was a crime, it's still a crime. And I think the other thing that interests me is what presidents have spoken up about this. One major president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, general, and a Republican. I ask myself, why don't we have his distinguished talk of January 7th a holiday? Military-industrial complex, he said, and the Congress he involved. We have not declared war in this country since World War II. That should be considered illegal. These are presidents' wars. George W. Bush and company are criminals. They have not been held accountable. To this day, not held accountable. So if you're not held accountable, you do it more. You do it again. And this goes for corporate America too, which is involved in things like war. Boeing is an airplane, they produce airplanes, but they also produce war materials. Not held accountable, whether it's in peacetime or in war. So I think this is very critical to think about these issues. Now, I want to talk about veterans. How do we feel if you're a parent of the 2,000 plus 2,500 soldiers who died in Afghanistan? What did they die for? Military-industrial complex? What did they die for? Imagine their families. Nothing. They're dead. Not only are the Afghans dead, our soldiers are dead. Same with Vietnam. It's in the military, the Veterans Against War. That could be a party, Veterans Against War, because our two-party system, we're both for war. There's no anti-war party, political party in this country. So I agree with but Ahmed's comment about the recent agreement with Britain and Australia and nuclear submarines. What? This is a president who talked about ending these endless wars, and all of a sudden he's turned his attention to China. Are we headed more in that direction? Ahmed was very right to point that out. It's very recent, and we keep on going. So what do we do to stop this? Well, Veterans Against the War is a good place. The families of the veterans who died is a good place for organization. Teaching our students American history with David Vine's book, United States of War, very important. The young need to know these things in a direct, contemporary manner so they'll know how to deal with it. I don't have much else to say, so I will stop. And if there are any questions, I'd love to answer.
Laura, thank you so much. Beautifully put. Let me turn things over next to Nasreen Sajady, and we will be moving soon to a brief period in which the panelists can respond to one another and then open things up to questions and conversation with the audience as a whole.
Thank you for having me. Wait, did you have something to say?
I just was going to briefly mention that you were born in Minnesota to immigrants from Afghanistan and are an educator. I mentioned that you were teaching today, and you're supporting grassroots organizing efforts with others in the Afghan diaspora to meet the needs of the refugees arriving in the Midwest. And I'm going to place some links related to Nasreen's work, but let you speak for yourself.
Thank you. So we were asked to sum up 20 years, 3 takeaways, 20 years of Afghanistan, and that's pretty impossible to do. I think most of you have studied history and know that the world has been playing chess in Afghanistan for thousands of years. Everybody has been trying to take control over those lands, and it's pretty difficult to summarize in 7 minutes. Peter tried. It wasn't possible. And that was just 40 years. And so it's a complicated place. It's a really complicated land. It's a mystical land. It's a rich in culture, rich in people, rich in beauty. And that is one of the takeaways I think that I want to mention, is that we are more than war. And that is always the conversation when we talk about Afghanistan. We are just more than war. We have some of the most mystical religions in the world come from those lands. Zoroastrianism, some of the oldest Buddhist statues, 5,000-year-old Buddhist statues are in Afghanistan. Hinduism, like, it is mystical, it is beautiful, it is rich, it is deep. We are deeply connected to our land. And when you talk to an Afghan, we will always be proud of our land. I've never even been there, and this is the biggest heartbreak I've ever experienced. Sorry, it's a lot. So my call out to the diaspora at this time is you hear the way people talk about us and the way we are numbers. We're 3.8 million, 2.5 million. We're percentages. We're just know that your culture and who you are is important too, and those narratives should be talked about, and there should be more Afghan representation in these conversations. We are not a monolith. We are a diverse group with multiple tribes, multiple experiences, multiple religions, multiple beliefs. I just want my diaspora to know that, and to know that we can keep showing up and we can keep fighting. And this isn't over. This war is not over. The US is still presently in Afghanistan. They have their mercenaries present. They have their contractors present that are extracting our minerals, that are protecting the poppy fields to support their billion-dollar opium industries. They are very, very present still. I also want to talk about the way that the US has, Peter covered it a little bit, about how the US created the Taliban ultimately. They funded the Mujahideen to fight the Taraki government, which was also a very violent government. They were forcing Western communism violently across Afghanistan, which is a big part of why my family fled. And the Mujahideen was present because they were trying to fight that colonization in another extreme way against them. We talked about how the Taliban was created essentially in these madrasas in the refugee camps in the southern border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. The books that they were reading were printed in the United States, in Nebraska. The US had a hand in creating the Taliban. The US still funds the Taliban through Pakistan. You can go to the CIA's website. It shows that it says on their site that they give $4 billion a year to Pakistan as a grant for defense. Pakistan funds the ISI funds the Taliban. The Taliban keeps Afghanistan in a state of chaos, and the US can always go in and extract whatever they need. While the rest of us, we are the largest diaspora in the world, one of the largest. We are all over the world. We literally have been blown across the world the last 40 years. Not to mention the 2.5 million people who died in the first war. And then we're seeing maybe 750,000 that have died. We don't know that number. Afghanistan is very tribal. It is one of the, we don't even know how many people exist in Afghanistan. The people that live in the mountains, the people that live in the tribes. There are so many people in Afghanistan. There is no way, there's no census to be able to create these data points and these numbers to summarize our existence. Sorry, I'm very emotional right now. I felt the emotion and the passion from all of you, and I loved it, and it's beautiful, and I'm grateful that you all have that. Some of the priorities we need for change, we need the US to stop funding Pakistan. We need this to stop. We need them to stop funding the Taliban. We need to pay attention to the fact that this is a very part of the reason the US wanted and controller of Afghanistan is the location of where Afghanistan is. It is in the center, it is the heart of Asia. SWANA, Southwest Asia, North Africa, is a decolonial term for the Middle East. SWANA, Central Asia, and South Asia all claim Afghanistan as theirs. We are the heart of Asia. Afghanistan is in the center. You have Iran, you have Russia, you have China, you have India, all surrounding it. The US has a base now that gets to watch all of these countries that it is always fighting with, always in conflict with. They are right there. We need to remember that this war was not to save the damsel in distress. That was an easy way to feed this to the patriarchal societies that eat it up. We need to remember that. It was never about the people. It was never about finding Osama bin Laden. It was always about the geopolitical position and extracting and taking the resources. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Nasreen, I think I'm a bit at a loss for words as well, but I want to just thank you for bringing the emotion and heart and analysis that you shared with us. I'd like to now open things up to the other panelists to offer 1 or 2 minutes of response before we open things up to the audience as a whole, to questions and comments. Let me just see if, Peter, I see your hand, but let me see if any of the other speakers want to respond to any aspect of what they heard from the others.
David, I'm sorry, I'm a little unclear. Are you asking the speakers who just spoke to respond or for other speakers?
Yeah, I'm sorry for the lack of clarity. Yeah, just for the panel, you and the other panelists who just spoke, to offer 1 or 2 words, 1 or 2 minutes worth of words responding to any of what you heard from the other speakers. Do you want to kick us off? Thank you.
Sure. Just very quickly, thank you, Nasreen, for your words. And I just want to say I particularly appreciated your focus on the opposition to colonial occupation that was so much at the root of fighting back, I would argue, far more than resentment about others teaching women to read, that it was about that occupation. So I was very grateful for that. The only thing I wanted to mention that came up in a couple of different ways, but I think not as strongly enough as I think it should, is to recognize that while it was not nearly as strong as it needed to be, and it didn't ultimately succeed, there was a movement against this war that emerged within literally hours of the 9/11 attacks, before it had even been announced, and as soon as it was announced, and as soon as the attacks began. In that 3-week period, there were protests all over the country. The first big one that was called nationally was held in New York on the day the first bombs were dropped on October 7th. And that movement never stopped. It led to the creation of 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, who had all lost loved ones in the Twin Towers, who came together to say, our grief is not a call for war. And I think it's important that we, in this country, as we look forward to what we need to do to build movements to prevent more wars, that we keep in mind that these wars have emerged and have grown and thrived throughout those 20 years, that we should not sort of assume that because those wars were not stopped by that movement, that somehow it wasn't there.
Thank you for that important reminder, Phyllis. Laura, do you want to respond to anything, or Nasreen, or Peter?
I'm fine.
Okay, Peter, do you want to offer just a minute or two, and just note, before we were hearing your papers rustling a bit, so just be careful with that. And let me just invite people to start offering questions or comments in the chat. I will also look for either your virtual hand or your actual hand. If you do that, please wave it wildly so I am sure to see it in just a moment, so that we can get some questions and comments and conversation with the audience. Peter.
Thanks, David. I thought all of the presentations were terrific, so I'm not taking issue with anything, but I wanted to offer a slightly different perspective than Laura's on President Eisenhower and his warning about the military-industrial complex. I think the reason why Eisenhower knew the dangers of the military-industrial complex was that he created it. That when Eisenhower took office, the US had 1,000 nuclear weapons, a little more than 1,000. By the time he left office, the US had 22,000 plus nuclear weapons. By the time his budgeting cycle was finished, the US had 30,000 nuclear weapons. When he took office, nuclear weapons were our last resort. When he left office, they were our first resort. When he took office, they were in the hands of the civilians. During his presidency, they were put in the hands of the military. Initially, there was one finger on the nuclear button. By the time Eisenhower left office, with subdelegation and sub-subdelegation, there were scores of fingers on the nuclear button. So I think that I agree with the point that you were making, that his warning about the military-industrial complex was prescient and necessary. But I think we have to also look at that period and see I could go into a lot more, but I won't, in terms of what Eisenhower represented as a historical figure.
Thank you very much for those fill-ins. I think that we ought to take the good that can come out of it. The good that can come out of it would be to focus on what he said in his farewell address. And by that time, maybe he was sorry, who knows? But regardless, we can use that.
Laura, I don't think Peter was done speaking.
No, I was.
What?
Go ahead, Laura. I think you're great. Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry?
No, go ahead.
Please do go ahead.
I'm not sure what's going on.
It was an inadvertent interruption, so please do continue.
No, I was just saying that thank you for filling in on what Eisenhower did as president. But given he gave this talk His farewell address.
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Am I not speaking loud enough?
I can hear you just fine. So keep going.
So let's just take what's good that we can use, because we even have a foundation that pushes for some of Eisenhower's farewell address comments. But thank you for filling in.
Thank you, Laura. Let me ask now Nasreen, did you want to respond to anything?
No, I don't have anything to respond to. I mean, I can talk a little bit about the grassroots organizing efforts that we're doing and how folks can show up right now. So I live in Minneapolis. I think if people are paying attention to the last year and a half or so, we have become kind of the center of movements at the moment. I live in George Floyd Square. He was murdered 500 feet from my door. So I have been very involved in organizing with our community and keeping
Actually, I think George Floyd overdosed. I don't think he was murdered.
I think we might have a troll.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Someone just blocked.
Sorry. Hold on one second.
Anyway, so
if you can unmute yourself, Nasreen, I think
thank you. So we've been very involved in organizing with the community, and I've learned so much about community organizing from these folks. We also have Line 3 protests here that are just a few hours north of us. And so we have so many organizers and activists present in Minnesota right now, all the time. We're always fighting.
So many people without jobs.
Hold on,
many of us have jobs, actually. We just have passion for humanity, regardless. So we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about organizing. We learned a lot about how it is very important to show up for each other. And so we organized a rally that invited many of the folks that we have met to come speak about the ways that the US has hurt them, because this is not a new thing. This is not a new story. The US goes with the idea of saving the people, bringing democracy, takes what they need and leaves them worse off. So we invited folks from other communities that have experienced this to talk about their story and talk about how
this girl is just straight up retarded. Oh my gosh.
They showed up as refugees. And so they came together, and we had this beautiful community, a diverse community that showed up for each other. And from there, we started organizing for the refugees that are arriving. And so Fort McCoy, which is in Wisconsin, is about 2.5 hours away from Minneapolis. And we have been community members have been coming together. We have been connecting with folks in Fort McCoy. They are said to have about 13,000 refugees in that facility. And so my girlfriend and I are in conversation with the state every day. I have a call with them as soon as I hang up with this. They are texting, we are calling having meetings with them regularly to know how the state is supporting the refugees that are arriving, and what resources are available to them. There's not a lot available to them. Housing is a huge one. Housing is a problem already for us in the US. And so we have thousands more people coming, and housing is going to be a major issue for them. And so we are in connection with the refugees in the camp, in the bases, and we get messages from people that are saying, like, we've been in the same clothes for 20 days. Can you bring us some clothes? So we have people who are dropping off donations. We have people that are boxing up these donations, putting room numbers on them and driving them to them. And so folks have clothes, folks have phones, folks have underwear, folks have shampoo, folks have things that they are not getting in these bases. We are also organizing with all of the local organizations to support food, transportation, education, translators, healthcare. There are so many things these folks need. They're coming with nothing or with maybe a small bag. We also have 2 different types of visas that we're addressing. We have the civ visa, which are the folks that will have asylum that worked for the government. But then we have the majority that are coming on humanitarian parole visas. And those folks get 0 federal benefits, only state benefits at this point. And I had read somewhere recently that Biden was asking Congress to give them the same benefits as the refugees. But again, it's the like, is Congress going to do it? We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. We have to prepare for the worst at this point. And so we are doing everything we can to make sure that these folks have a place to stay, to make sure that they have food, to make sure that they are safe after leaving such a traumatic situation. We do not want to further traumatize them. So I encourage any organizers, especially the Afghan community, to step up and ask questions. Minnesota is a great place for refugees. We have a very large Hmong community and we have a huge Somali community. We've done this before, but other states don't have as many state benefits as we do. So find the gaps and figure it out, because these folks need our help right now.
Thank you so much, Nasreen. Thank you especially for dealing so beautifully with the very rude, to say the least, Zoom bombers. I apologize for not being able to handle that more rapidly, but now we shouldn't be interrupted again. Raed, I also didn't have a chance to ask you if you wanted to respond to any of what we've heard. So let me do that, and then, but also invite people in the audience to put questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, or to raise your hand, and I will very cautiously allow folks to unmute themselves.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Nasreen. You're doing an amazing job of what you say and how you say it. Sometimes, you know, we learn a lot of information from these panels, but we also learn how to act when we're attacked. And thank you for giving us all a great example of how to act. And David, thank you for all of your technical expertise and cybersecurity. I just wanted to comment on one issue that is a common thread of this trail of destruction that the empire leaves behind. And now we have this trail of destruction in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other parts of the world. There are a couple of underlying assumptions that bother me with it. One of them is the responsibility for the United States to help refugees and displaced people and civilians who paid a price for these wars. The discourse in DC tries to limit this responsibility to only those who worked for the United States, or those who are quote unquote friendly to the United States. And it's not rooted in any bigger moral, justification. It's not rooted in international law. It's not rooted in like refugee conventions. And it bothers me for two reasons. The first one is that the implication that, our so-called friends, like let's say our Iraqi friends, our Afghan friends, we shouldn't leave them behind. This is like, creation of two classes of citizens in these countries that the US invades, ravages, and occupies and destroys. One class is our friends, and these are people who are employed by the United States. And one class is not our friends, people who are, the 99% of the population who are out there, who the implication is we don't really owe them anything. It's not accurate that this is what the US responsibility ends. The US responsibility does not end to only those who are employed by the United States. It actually extends to every civilian in these countries. And this is according to international law, according to international norms, again, according to our most basic human connections, that when we invade another country and destroy other people's homes and countries, the United States and us as citizens owe them compensation. We owe them, reparations for what happened in their country. And as a part of that, there is also a responsibility to help those who are the most vulnerable to relocate. The United Nations has a very good, outline for helping displaced people. It has like a 3-level outline for help. The level number 3 is helping the most immediate people in need, and these are the most politically or medically vulnerable people. So like to resettle them in third countries. Someone who's gonna die because of a medical situation, someone who is under immediate threat because of their political or whatever other reasons, that they should be resettled to other countries, and that's regardless whether or not they were employed by the US. The second level is, according to the UN, is trying to help some of these displaced communities settle where they are at now. Like if some of them are in Iran or Pakistan or other neighboring countries, to like ease their suffering, help give them access to basic services, etc. But the number 1 resolution is voluntary repatriation, and the United Nations says that. I think it's a very good idea, because the ultimate solution for the Iraqi displacement crisis is not to move them all to Texas. It's to create the right conditions in Iraq for Iraqis to go back home, to create the right conditions in Afghanistan, so the Afghans will choose to go back home voluntarily. And the US is definitely not working with that. So that's the first track, like the friend of friend. The other track is that it also gives this implication that like when you work with us, you're gonna get some sort of like a gift, which is actually not accurate. So I know as a fact that those Iraqis and Afghans who work with the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan are treated as second-class humans. They're not like treated as like one of us. That's never been the case. For a few months I worked with a US company called IREX that was operating out of Iraq. It was working with the State Department. So I had one trip to the IREX office in Baghdad, and you see, I went to the green zone one time. I went to saw these US compounds, and the system of racial segregation that exists in the green zone and these US compounds is so disgusting. It is like 1940s America. Iraqis had their own cafeterias. They were not allowed to the international cafeteria, quote unquote. They were not allowed to the international mall. They were not allowed to international. International is a code for non-Iraqi. The barber shop, the gym. So I was the only US American of Iraqi descent. I'm half Iraqi and half Palestinian. When I used to go eat in the international cafeteria, people would ask me, "Excuse me, are you lost?" I'm like, no, I am. I just happen to be of Iraqi descent, but I'm actually a US citizen. I had to wear a flak jacket when I went around Baghdad, and I was sitting in an armored vehicle to travel around. And when my Iraqi colleagues had to come with me to a meeting, they were not given a flak jacket, even though they were sitting next to me in the same car. So this assumption that the United States takes care of our friends is also flawed. Iraqis who work with the US are abused on a daily basis. They are underpaid, overworked, they're put in danger. There is absolutely no interest in their security. And as Nasreen was coming with, when they come here to the United States, they end up in miserable situations they're misguided. They end up in situations where their life is miserable and awful. And I have tried to help many of these Iraqi families resettle in Washington, D.C. The conditions are unbelievably sad between their housing or their employment here in the US, etc. So anyway, I just want to point that out, that when we talk about the US obligations, the example, and I'm sorry, this took longer than I anticipated, David. The example that I always give is that when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, Iraq was kicked out of Kuwait, and Iraq is still paying compensation to Kuwait till this day. There is an UN compensation commission, UNCC, that was set to calculate all of the damages that Iraq caused to Kuwait, including imaginary losses, like for example, 5-star hotels that were not filled during the occupation, like an actual projection, not actual damages like destruction, you know. So Iraq also deserves to get compensation from the United States. The Iraqi people deserve to get compensation from this country. Afghans and Afghanistan deserves reparations and compensation from the United States. And the fact that the US is turning this conversation into whether or not we should be accepting a very limited, few thousands of SIV applicants and their families, that is literally the tip of the iceberg. You know, whether or not they accepted them. So I just want to take us back to the bigger issue. This is an issue of trillions of dollars of compensation that the United States owes Iraqis and Afghans and other countries that it destroyed. It's not just about resettling a few families here and there in DC and other places.
Thank you, Raed. I couldn't agree more. Let me just read a couple of the comments that have come in the chat box, and then again, invite others to ask questions or offer comments in the chat box, which I'd be happy to read, or I will very carefully allow some people to unmute themselves. Again, apologies for my allowing that interruption to have taken place. There's $6 billion, Phyllis Bennis notes, that has been slated to pay for continuing US war in Afghanistan. There should be demands that that money be turned over to support Afghan refugees. Another comment, one thing that seems particularly disturbing besides that troll is the sheer length of the state of war that has reshaped academics, shifting so much of the humanities into security studies and retooling industries so they aren't just on wartime production, but completely transformed to profit from the war, and even worse, the everydayness of the war that young people have now grown up with as a permanent condition. How possible will it really be to leave the war on terror? And then really helpful, someone, Corey Peterson-Smith, offering solidarity with Nasreen, which I really appreciate. Maybe we could, there is what seems to be a very important question. How possible will it really be to leave the war on terror? I wonder which of our panelists might like to respond to that. Phyllis, yeah, please.
Just one point, which I think is less specific to the war on terror than it is to the US addiction to war more broadly, which has to do with how the wars are so profitable and for whom. Because, you know, my colleagues at IPS, at the National Priorities Project, and at our Global Economy projects have done enormous, fantastic work documenting the CEO pay of these companies that are just literally making a killing off of the production of bombs and submarines and et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough is the scale of the relationship between those billions of dollars and what happens in Congress, where the money is given out. Our tax money is assigned, if you will. And it's the one, I mean, I'm not one for conspiracies, but the one conspiracy I never could figure out another way it could have happened. So I come back to the conspiracy, is that after World War II, when there had been very strict control over to prevent war profiteering, some of those laws were released or at least relaxed. And one of the things that happened was that these companies figured out a way that they could continue to get paid by the Congress to be producing stuff that in theory they shouldn't need anymore because this giant global war had just ended, right? So how was it that Congress kept voting? And it turned out that what they had created was the notion of the least efficient way of doing military production, which is, you know, I'm no expert on sort of military production, but my understanding is with all production, the most efficient way is to do it vertically. Everything is made in one place. So you're not shipping things, parts across the world to be amended and then back to somewhere else to be inserted in a bigger thing. And that thing gets inserted into another little gizmo somewhere else. Instead, they decided we're going to do it exactly like that. So virtually every congressional district in this country, 435 of them, have companies that are producing some gadget, some gizmo that plays some role in the production of military supplies, weapons systems, etc. So no member of Congress, even the ones who are the most committed to ending wars in theory, are often not prepared to vote against a specific decision about giving money, paying money to these companies to produce ex-military system to kill people in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia, in the Sahel, in the Philippines, wherever it might be, because they might lose 10 jobs, 30 jobs, 300 jobs in their district, and they're afraid that that would be the basis on which they would lose their next election. And it's worked like a charm. It's really very successful. So I think that it's something that we always have to keep in mind, that they've done it quite brilliantly, and it has lasted for 40 years. You know, I think that most of the production still is like that. It's not all made in one place. It's stuff is being put on trucks and sent across the country and back across to the other side. And that's what makes it very, very hard to get people to cut the military budget. So the campaigns that are now underway to cut the military budget, Barbara Lee has a resolution in the Congress right now to cut the military budget by 10% as a first step towards cutting it in half, cutting $350 billion from that military budget. I think we have to come back to the urgency of that.
Thank you, Phyllis. Beautifully put, and a reminder that historians believe that Eisenhower originally termed the military-industrial complex the military-industrial congressional complex. Let me see if others want to take on this question of how possible it will be to leave the war on terror, especially given the structural barriers that Phyllis just pointed to. Peter, please.
Okay, just two quick points. Well, when the Cold War ended, a top Soviet expert said that we're going to do the worst thing possible to you, to the United States. We're going to leave you without an enemy. We were very adept at finding a lot of other enemies very quickly. George Bush quickly invaded Kuwait in the first Gulf War. We also quickly invaded Panama. So we found enemies without any problem. I wanted to mention something else that Phyllis got me thinking about, and that's a fascinating set of hearings that were conducted in the Senate in the mid-1930s on a committee headed by Gerald Nye. And the Nye committee hearings were to propose legislation to take all the profit away from the defense contractors. In the aftermath of World War I, there was a lot of deep anger toward the defense contractors and their role in getting the US involved in that war. They were referred to as the merchants of death. And in these hearings, they proposed anything from immediate nationalization of the war industry to 99% tax of all profits. And it even had the backing of Roosevelt for a period of time. I won't go into the history of how that got undermined, but it was an intriguing concept that had widespread national support in the 1930s. The idea, as appalling as it is to us, that drug manufacturers should make a profit off of COVID drugs and other things keep people alive. The idea that people should make a profit off of the death, off of every drone that goes off, every bomb, every tank that's built. People are making a profit off of this and they're lobbying for it. So, I mean, I'm not sure, maybe Phyllis has some ideas how to mobilize on that issue and educate on that. But I think it's a very important historical lesson that has been forgotten.
Let me see if Laura or Nasreen wants to jump into the conversation, take us in any direction. And then Phyllis might also want to respond.
I'd rather hear from Nasreen or Laura first.
There we go. I couldn't unmute. It wasn't allowing me. Ending a war is not for like asking how the war will end or ending a war is not something that Black, Indigenous, people of color have the option of doing. The war doesn't stop once the bombs stop. We have to rebuild, we have to heal, we have to learn how to live all over again. That's still war. That's still war. We're still having to clean it up. So it doesn't just end because the US decides it ends. It doesn't end because academics decide that this is the end, this is the date. We're gonna put that in the book. That's the end. That's not the end. That's not the end. So my mom jumped on the stage during our rally and which was weird because my mom is very shy. She jumped on the stage and she took the microphone and she said, "We fought for this flag 40 years ago. My kids are fighting for this flag now. I don't want my grandkids to have to fight for this flag." Like, the war doesn't end because someone decides that they're not going to stop dropping bombs. We still have to pick up our communities and figure out how to heal from this. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
Thank you again, Nasreen. Laura, yes, please do go ahead. I think your assistant will have to unmute you. And then Raed. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay. I think that a lot more emphasis has to be placed on how the wars hurt Americans. Mostly people don't give a damn about the people in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else. They might care about the fact that it hurts us, not just the budget. It could be used for things we need here at home. The reputation of the United States. We keep pushing, the media really is not very helpful in these kinds of things. We keep pushing the notion that somehow we're doing good. We're helping the women of Afghanistan or Iraq, or we're doing all this for them. When in fact, it's harming America, its reputation, its people, its soldiers, for God's sakes. Why did all those people die? American soldiers die in Afghanistan. They died for the military-industrial complex. They didn't die as patriots. We portray them as patriots unless you're somebody who came back alive and thinks otherwise. So I think we have to realize that people care about themselves. So let's talk partly, at least, about what these wars have done to our reputation, to our economics, to our jobs, to our soldiers, to all the things that affect Americans, because we care. That's one way to get people to care. I talk to students about these kinds of things, and I have veterans in my classes, and you should hear the veterans talk when they come back. They're the best peacemakers you could possibly have. So let's push these Veterans for Peace communities, groups. And I say, since both parties are warmongering and still are warmongering, given what Ahmed said about this New Deal with Australia, et cetera, that we should push for a party maybe that is anti-war.
Thank you, Laura. And let me just recommend to anyone who wasn't part of our first panel, I would encourage folks to listen to the first panel where we had Kyle Bibby from Common Defense and Claire Baird, who's worked with a number of anti-war veterans groups, including About Face, two great examples. But we have one person who wants to jump into the conversation, and then maybe we'll turn back to Raed and some of the other panelists, but want to get more voices to join, and especially Mauricio Czerny, an old friend and activist. Mauricio, please unmute yourself.
Hi, good afternoon all, or good evening or good morning, where everyone is, I'm not sure. But thank you everyone for your time and your incredible work. I'm an IPCR, second year IPCR student, that's International Peace and Conflict Resolution at an American at SIS. And a lot of my focus is shifted more towards domestic conflict, including what we call it now domestic terrorism here. And as I've studied it here, and as I think it appears abroad, something I only vaguely heard in conversation, but I was very glad to hear Nasreen mention, and I'm finding myself wanting to spend more time understanding, is how much actually continuously our war and need for empire does come from, unfortunately, a very patriarch concept that exists globally, but definitely the United States is still so tied into joining the military and, even as I was raised a Quaker, but even at 15, I watched enough of Top Gun and all those ridiculous films to believe that I needed to fly an Air Force F-14 in order to be an American. And I kind of always look back at those kinds of moments where I realize how much dominance war portrays in a young boy's mind or ideology. And I just love to hear anyone's talk about their work or interest in work, because I'm finding myself now to shift more wanting to work with young people who, helping young people shift away from the need to believe that to be a male or to be even American has to do with war and conquest and all these things that are often very subtle, but are still very much a part of our society. But anyway, I just want to thank everyone for contributing that. And I didn't hear that as a solution, but I do think that might be another solution on how globally and domestically we end this sort of obsession with war.
Thank you, Mauricio. Yeah, thank you for bringing gender more to the center of the conversation and how masculinity is constructed in our society. Let me let any of the panelists take on that question and offer a final thought, each in 1 minute, unfortunately, because we're about to run out of time. I think Raed was next in line.
I just really wanted to thank Nasreen, and I can feel her pain. I want to thank her for doing the emotional labor to speak about these issues. And I think, like, I was in a very similar place 10 or 15 years ago. And I remember my emotions being very raw, it's very hard for us who are at the receiving ends of bombs of this empire to talk about this, and I appreciate all of her time and all of the insights from an Afghan American perspective. I want to say that I like my most important thing that I learned today, like hearing Nasreen, is this, like, regardless of our political analysis of whether or not this war should end or should not end, should be there, should be not there, there are real humans, like the way that Nasreen describes her family or people who are stuck, who are unable to come. There are real humans who are paying a very extremely heavy price to decisions that are made in this town in Washington, D.C. And sometimes, not speaking to Iraqis and Afghans and Palestinians and other people around the world who are directly affected by US policies makes it seem as like an abstract conversation that we're having here, but it is an extremely painful conversation. And I really agree that wars will never end with one decision. Whether or not we like ending wars, it's about keeping an eye on how to end it the right way, keeping an eye on the affected communities that paid prices, whether they are Afghans, Iraqis, indigenous communities, or the veteran communities in the US. Ending wars might take longer than actually waging wars. And this is a 20-year war that might take, decades and decades. And
Thank you, Raed, for those beautiful words. Nasreen, Laura, Phyllis, Peter, a final minute to summarize some final thoughts you want to share with everyone.
Yeah. I'd like to just end with a comment about accountability. Our presidents, Bush and Cheney, were never held accountable. If you're not held accountable, you do the same thing again. Obama was not held accountable for being the drone war president. In fact, he was rewarded because supposedly it was going to save American lives. So accountability in a democracy preserves democracy. If you don't account, that's where the Congress is failing. They're failing their job. You don't declare war without Congress. And if you take an executive job to war, you have to be accountable.
Powerfully put. Nasreen, Phyllis, yeah, please, Phyllis.
Just a word on accountability. I absolutely agree with Laura. And I particularly want to come back to something that Nasreen said, because I think her words are so very important today. And that is that accountability has two parts. It's holding accountable the perpetrators, and it's being accountable to the victims, the people who were under those bombs. So I think those of us who think about accountability sort of all the time, we don't always think about both, and we need to. And if we don't, it's incomplete. And that's what our work has to include. So thank you for reminding us of that, Nasreen.
Thank you, Phyllis. Nasreen, did it look like you're unmuting or?
I am unmuting. Thank you. My final thoughts, I want us to, there's a lot of talk about what's happening to the women right now in Afghanistan with the new version of the Taliban, this more even extremist Wahhabi version of the Taliban that has been created. We also need to remember that there are other folks being persecuted. There is mass genocide, mass violence against the Hazara community. They are targeting the LGBTQIA community. They are targeting artists. They are burning instruments. They are erasing culture. They are erasing educators. They are trying to erase the existence of Afghanistan. And so I don't know how to address it. I don't know what we do in this situation, but there is a lot of violence that is happening to the folks in Afghanistan right now. And so the war has not ended because the US has left. There is still a lot of violence and a lot of fear. And I want to make sure that we acknowledge and we keep the conversation going so those people aren't forgotten.
Thank you, Nasreen. Peter, real quick.
I really appreciate the human level on which much of this discussion has been based, but I want to take it back to my obsessions one more time, and that's the existential threats that we're facing now as a planetary community. Both global warming, the long-term threat, and nuclear war, the short-term threat. And I see the people who have brought us the wars that we're talking about, the post 9/11 wars, are also the people who are planning the new Cold War against China and Russia at a time when we need to be thinking in planetary terms about how we as a human species are going to save our planet. These people instead are trying to divide and conquer and perpetuate the same kinds of oppressive systems that led to the wars that we're talking about. And so when Admiral Charles Richard, the chairman, the US strategic commander, says that he thinks nuclear war is a real possibility within the next 5 years, I think we need to take him very, very seriously and look at the crises in Ukraine and Taiwan, in addition to the messes we've already created, and make sure that these people don't do the worst case scenarios that I so fear.
Thank you, Peter. Let me just thank again, Nasreen, especially echoing what others have said, for the difficult work you did to share your thoughts and feelings and heart with us today. Thank you to Laura, thank you to Phyllis, thank you to Raed, thank you, Peter. I want to thank all the audience members for your contributions, and I hope that people are walking away facing the challenges ahead of us, but not paralyzed by those challenges, but instead as inspired as I am, and as touched by the words we've heard today. So thank you, everyone. I'm including in the chat box and in the description in the YouTube on the YouTube page for those watching the video after the fact, a list of links, which I'll continue to update with any links that anyone wants to provide me to give people additional opportunities to act on the basis of what we've heard. So thank you again, everyone, for this beautiful time together. I greatly appreciate it and bow down at your feet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all.